Now, the next story I heard was from an individual named Brad. And as a kid, he used to live up in Aroostook County near what was called the Loring Air Force Base, which for years, I guess, had been closed. But as a kid, he used to experience Bigfoots, UFOs, and they went exploring in this abandoned Air Force base. And this is actually what Brad had to say.
Now, Aroostook County, where this story took place, is a county that's actually in the northern part of Maine. It's known for its potato farming and the timber industry, but it's also known for some very bizarre stories that come out of it. For centuries, the Native American tribes that inhabit this Atlantic province have warned people of giant hairy creatures that inhabit the area, and they're told to stay away from them because if they anger them, they're going to end up pretty much getting killed. These creatures lived in the mountaintops and in the deep woods, and they would come down and raid the villages and often steal their fish and their food, and sometimes even take their women and their children and just drag them off into the wilderness. Now, the Algonquin tribe actually has what they call the Wendigo, which is very similar to Sasquatch creatures. And it's said that this is a very cannibalistic type of creature, and again, people are warned to stay away from it. Now, when the first settlers came to this area, the Indians shared these stories of the giant hairy creatures that roam throughout the woods there, and they were warned about them. Early settlers actually ended up disappearing when they went in there, the trappers. When the logging industry started back in the 1800s, there were stories of large massacres of the loggers and limbs being torn from them and beheaded. And so the stories continued over the centuries until the present day. These stories still continue. Now, Loring Air Force Base sits way up in the northeast on the Canadian border. And for decades, it was the central point of the Atlantic seaboard to protect us from intruders. There were large munition depots and buildings that housed all kinds of weapons. And actually was a very big hub for UFO activity. Back in the 1970s, for 2 weeks straight, every night a UFO would come and sit over one of the big buildings that housed the munitions. And it was a surprising thing at the time because even though it wasn't high technology back then, it was considered a very cloaked building that, people would not be able to tell that there were munitions in it. But for some reason, this UFO kept coming to this building and just sitting on top of it. And this went on for weeks. Now, Brad was around 14 at the time, living in this area. And he and some buddies, there were 4 friends of his altogether, there was 5, decided to explore the woods in the area. And when they came through the woods, they discovered the Loring Air Force Base, and they decided to walk around the perimeter of it. And when they did so, they came across these very large 3-toed footprints. He said they were about 14 to 16 inches long. And they got their attention, and they ended up starting to follow these footprints around the perimeter fencing of the Loring Air Force Base. They eventually came up to a spot where there was a big tear in the fence, and the footprints actually went through it. So the boys followed the footprints through and ended up coming up to one of the larger buildings. And they discovered as they walked around the perimeter of it that the footprints actually came to a big metal door. The door was pretty much like halfway torn off, hanging on its hinges, and the footprints went through the door. So the curious boys, not really being too fearful at the time because of the numbers they had, started heading down into the building, and there were broken windows and mud all over the floor, and it was damp and wet from rain that had come in. And they were able to continue to follow these footprints past all these deserted rooms, and they headed up down these different hallways just following the footprints. Now, eventually, they came to this very long hallway, and the boys started heading down the hallway, and all of a sudden, they started hearing this baby crying. This very loud, screaming, crying baby down the end of the hallway. Now, one of the boys was really concerned that somebody might have kidnapped the baby and was holding it down there, and he wanted to go down and explore. But Brad said he noticed that even though it sounded like a baby, it was just kind of off. It sounded like a deeper type of cry than a normal baby would have. And he turned to his friends and he said, "Whatever this is," he says, "that's not a baby. That's actually trying to lure us down there." He says, "I don't think we should go down there." And the baby noise continued, and there was a little bit of an argument between the boys as, whether they should leave or continue down there and rescue a baby. So they ended up deciding to leave, and they ended up telling the police department, and the police department did actually go down there and explore, but they never found anything. Now, what's interesting about the three-toed footprints is that these are usually associated with Sasquatches and Bigfoots, or skunk apes actually, down in the south. There's the folk monster that had 3 toes. There was, as I said, the skunk apes that had 3 toes. And there was the legend of Boggy Creek that had 3 toes. And also, there was what they call the Honey Island swamp monster. This also had 3 toes. So to find 3 toes way up in the northern part of Maine was kind of strange. But Brad said that there were a lot of reports of 5-toed footprints in the area. There were countless sightings of huge hairy creatures and beasts roaming throughout his area. And he also said that there was quite a bit of UFO activity, that it was actually a hub for UFO activity. So this was a very, very strange encounter.
So I've actually saved the best story for last. This was pretty interesting because, as I said, we were in actually Southwest Harbor area of Mount Desert Island, and the next story came from a person named Al, and the encounter that he had, the bizarre things that went on at the place that he was renting, actually was about 5 to 10 minutes at the most from where we were having our campfire at this house. So this is what happened to Al.
Now, Al told his story about having rented a house up on what they called Quarry Hill Road. It was so named because actually there was a abandoned quarry that sat right behind his house. But he had rented this really nice cabin in an area which was kind of at the base of Acadia Mountain. It was in the deep woods, surrounded by ponds, swamplands, and as I said, this quarry. So he had rented the house out about, I think it was like the beginning of May, just as things were kind of getting warm up in that area. And he said the events that happened started out with he would wake up at night and hear these loud, mournful calls and whoops and hollers coming from out near the mountaintop. And eventually, over the next couple days, these howls and whoops got closer to kind of like the quarry area behind his house. And he says as the days progressed, he would hear him actually getting closer to his house. For the next week, he had a rubbish barrel that was out in the back of his house that he had bungee cords over the top of it. It was a plastic type of barrel. And he said every morning he would come out and the bungee cords would be taken off, the top taken off, and all the trash would be like taken and scattered all over. He kept putting the bungee cords back on this thing, and this continued. It just, every night, something was coming around making noises, and taking the trash and dumping it. He said eventually this thing, whatever it was, the creature, I guess, gets sick and tired of taking the bungee cords off, and he put a huge hole, like something had taken a big fist and just punched a hole into the top of the trash and continued to take the trash out that way. So this kind of went on and things progressed, and pretty soon he was waking up at night and he was hearing strange voices outside his window below. He was hearing like something like Indian chatter, like Native Americans were talking. And actually, Ron Moorhead is known for what is called Sierra sounds, where they have what they dubbed samurai chatter, like these Native American voices going back and forth. And I had played a clip after for Al, and he described this as being very similar to what he had heard, that these creatures were outside and they were communicating with each other. And he at the time had a girlfriend staying there too, and occasionally he would take off on trips and he would come back and she was actually petrified with the screams and the activity that was going around this cabin. And then one night Al was sitting alone watching his laptop, watching a movie on his laptop. It was dark. He said it was probably about 10 o'clock at night, 10:30. And all he had on were some small lights in his living room. He had a great big deck that sat outside these large picture windows. And it was dark out. And he said all of a sudden he just started hearing this loud thumping running around the deck. And he looked up and he couldn't see anything, but he could hear these loud thumps on the deck, and he said it was so strong and loud that it was actually like vibrating into the living room. He said it was kind of like an elephant was running around out on the deck. And he stood up and he actually started to walk towards the window, and then he noticed this huge, luminous, large, dark shadow just outside the lights that were coming in from the interior. He said he saw like this 8 to 10 foot shadow just standing there, looming, looking back at him. And he was frozen. He was petrified. He just stood there and just watched out the window. And he said he saw this shadow, and he could hear the thumping on the deck again. He saw this shadow just run across the deck, and like he could tell was leaping over the side railing and then disappeared into the darkness. Al was absolutely petrified, and I don't think it was more than 2 weeks later that he ended up moving out of the place, and he has not been back there since.